All right. So my name is Alan Orozco. I'm a software engineer in the UI and accessibility working group in AMP. Um, and I would like to talk about the steps you need to take and what we're looking for when AMP has a new component contributed by you. Once I don't have controls over, oh, there you go. So first, what is an AMP component? AMP is not only a framework, but it is also a library of components. These components allow you um, to basically use additional functionality that the framework provides, just because of the fact that you cannot use JavaScript directly on an app document. The structure of these components is very simple. They're mainly custom HTML elements that extend the page. So for example, on normal documents, you have a bunch of default HTML elements like headers and diffs and frames and images and things like that. And a custom HTML element is just an element that you can write like an HTML tag, but it also has additional functionality. This additional functionality is implemented with JavaScript. Like I said earlier, the AMP framework does allow you to write your own custom JavaScript. So you need a component to do specific things. A component is also generic and reusable. If a component is only allowed or can only function to work on a particular site, it's not generic. And a component may also load external resources. These are encapsulated in components because the AMP runtime actually schedules when resources can be loaded by a particular component, because if it has a box in the page, it will try to not load that external resource until the box is closer to the viewport. There are three main categories of AMP components, as I would see it. A big chunk of them are UI components. These are just components that enable some sort of user interaction in your page, like a sidebar that pops up when you click on a button, like a light box that creates a model on some sort of interaction, like a date picker element that allows you to enter dates into a form, and many more, like AMP selector. I could go on. There's also third-party embeds. These are basically components that load an external resource, like a tweet with AMP Twitter or like a video with AMP YouTube, and put it in the component box. And there are components that just extend other components' functionality, like AMP Bind, that allows you to add interactivity to your sites in a declarative way. AMP Script, that allows you to write custom sandboxed JavaScript, or AMP Video Docking, for example, that doesn't create its own component, but actually allows videos to be docked. Even though all components hide complexity, it's not really about how complicated they are. We have a broad spectrum of complexity in all these elements. So for example, if you look at AMP image, that's one of our simplest elements. It only loads an image tag. Whereas something like AMP list or AMP bind with a little bit more functionality are kind of in the middle. And then you have something like AMP story that draws its own interface and schedules how components get loaded and adds a ton of functionality. So a component can be something really simple, like an image or a selector for a form, or it can also be very complicated, like an entire experience. So if you have a use case and an idea for a component that you would like to add to AMP, what do you need to do? So first of all, you have to know if your use case is fulfilled or not. The AMP framework already provides a ton of functionality and components that may allow you to do the particular feature that you're trying to add to your website already, just by combining or using a few things. So in its most basic form, AMP already has an actions and events functionality that allows you to create basic interactivity for your sites. It allows you to show and hide elements. It allows you to activate specific actions that other components may have. So for example, to open a lightbox. And you don't need any additional components to do this, except just using the actions and events that every component may have documented on app.dev. We also have AMP bind, which allows you to declaratively modify the DOM. This means that you can attach certain attributes or content of certain elements that already exist on your page to specific parts of state that can be changed by other elements themselves. This allows you to create a little bit more complicated interactivity, but you still don't have to write JavaScript. Or for example, if you're writing a very specific component like a video player, there may be already a component that allows you to do what you're trying to do. So for example, instead of creating a custom video component, you can use AMP video iframe to load any external video player and plug it into AMP's video features like autoplay and docking and analytics and that stuff. Your use case needs to be generic. So this means that it needs to be useful on other websites too. So for example, if we look at a very popular component, AMP image, that is used on nearly every page, it's generic because it can render any image. It doesn't render a specific format of an image or just images of a certain size. It knows how to render any of them. It's also reusable because it's useful for a large number of pages. Nearly every AMP page has an AMP image. So we know that it's not just useful for one particular application or website. And if I were to create a component that is an entire shopping cart experience that only works on my website, that is neither generic nor reusable because it only works for one vendor. For these cases, you may just need to use AmpScript instead. AmpScript allows you to have something similar to a component box that you can write JavaScript in, but without having to submit it to the AMP repo or having to release a specific component. So if you're doing a specific use case that is not reusable for other websites, it's actually less work for you to use AmpScript than it is to write a new component. So if you know that the component you have in mind is generic and reusable, you can start following the contributor guide on this link that I have here to just start writing code and see how our contribution process works. I will show an example of how you would go through this process, but this is all delineated in this document. So first, you need to file an intent to implement issue. These issues just describe what the structure of your component would be, the use case that it's trying to fulfill, and the attributes that it may use, and how it may interact with the page. This is just to give the working groups a heads up and other members of the AMP team as well that you are trying to introduce either a new feature or a new component. You first have to write an intent to implement so that you don't have to do extra work. It would be disappointing if you were to write all this code for your component only for it to be rejected when you send a pull request because it wasn't approved previously with an intent to implement. So this allows us to go through the design, decide if it's a component that is generic and reusable, and whether it's useful for their pages, or maybe also change some particular details of the component to make it more useful. So if we were to build our own component, I'm going to use a hypothetical example for an AMP toast component. This is generic because it can render any content inside of it. The idea is that a toast is a small element that pops up on the bottom left corner of your page briefly and can render anything inside it. So since it can render any content, it's not just useful for one particular website. And it's reusable because this is a common user experience that many websites may want to adapt. First, we need to define how it would be used. So for example, here, since I said earlier, AMP components are just custom HTML elements, we would define our custom AMP toast tag that would have a layout of no display because it's not visible initially and it's only popped up briefly. And you can interact with it via the actions and events system. So it will expose a default action that can also be used via the name pop that will make it appear when something else happens in the page. For example, when I click on a button. And you basically have this functionality. You have a button that activates the toast pops, and then after a brief second, it hides again. That's all our extension is going to do. So this is an example of how I would write my intent to implement. I would describe that it's a new component called AMP toast, a high-level description of what it does, which is floating a toast element at the bottom left corner of the page. Why I'm creating a new component. In this case, I can say, well, similar behavior can be replicated with CSS animations, but that's too complicated, and I would like to hide that complexity behind a component that can also be extended in the future to like include duration parameters or close buttons or things like that. So in additional context, I just have to include how my component is used. I say that it's a layout no display element with particular content inside of it and with an action that can be activated with a button. I copy the WG approvers group that is default in the intent to implement template. That is a general group that approves features, but I'm also copying the UI and accessibility working group because this is a UI component. And then I have to book a design review. These design reviews happen every Wednesday. And the idea of this is that we can have a formal discussion of how the component works and how it's supposed to be used. Sometimes you don't need to go through design review if your component is simple enough or is very similar to something like a third-party video player that doesn't implement any special features, then it may be possible that you don't need to go through design review, but we cannot know if it needs to go through design review or not until you file an intent to implement issue first. Although generally, most components have to go through design review so that they can be approved. What are we looking for when we go through a design review? What does the AMP team want from components? The most important thing is that components follow the AMP's design principles. These are subjective guidelines for how we want the framework and components to behave and how we want pages to work. I'm not gonna go through all of these here. I encourage you to go to this link to read more details about each of them. And also look at YouTube for previous presentations in which we talk about this. But these principles are just so that we can ensure that AMP has a consistent experience. For example, some of these are hard to explain concretely, but the fact that user experience is more important than developer experience means that if there has to be a trade-off to be made between user experience or developer experience, user experience will always win. That's our highest priority. And then we're also just trying to do things the right way. But I encourage you to go to this URL and look at each principle in more detail. We also care about Core Web Vitals, which are recently announced metrics that try to measure how good the user experience of a website is. These cannot be measured until your component is implemented, of course. But however, there are things that we can look at the design and the functionality of the proposed component to know if they're going to be, if they're going to change these values for the worse. For example, with cumulative layout shift, CLS, that's something that happens if the component dynamically changes its height, because then it will cause the rest of the content to shift, which is a bad experience, which Core Web Vitals have a punishment for, or actually like give you a worse metric. So, so just by knowing that the functionality of your component doesn't change height or width dynamically without user interaction, then we know that it's not going to be bad for CLS. In the same way, we're already guarding for these two other metrics in some sense, like the AMP framework does by default, in the sense that your largest contentful paint is not going to be affected by an extension in most cases, since they're loaded asynchronously. Same is the case for first input delay. The things that could affect something like first input delay is if your extension requires a really big library that would cause it to have a very large binary size. But this is also something that we can know by looking at the requirements and the intent to implement. Then you have to write the code for your component. We have a guide for all our different concepts, all our different workflows for contributing, but I'll give a high-level overview of how it works. We have a very handy utility in our repository, which is the make extension command line tool. You just run gulp make extension and the name of your extension, and that will generate a basic structure for your extension code. This basic structure looks like this. You first have an amptoast, a new amptoast directory in the extensions directory that contains the descriptions and the logic for your code, for your component. It has an amptoast MD file for documentation. This documentation gets propagated to our site amp.dev. You also have a validator file. For those unfamiliar with how AMP works, all pages are validated so that the API is used in a certain way. So this validator file describes how your element needs to be used, the attributes that it allows, the layouts that it allows, and so forth. So this is just a descriptor so that the validator knows how to validate future pages that include your extension. And you have a 0.1 directory that is the current version of your component that includes your tests and the logic for your component. It's always 0.1 by default, and all components stay in the same version unless you introduce a breaking change. And by breaking change, we mean that the API for your component doesn't allow things that it allowed previously. So for example, if I'm changing a video component from taking a source attribute to taking a source element without supporting the source attribute anymore, that would be a breaking change. And then I would have to introduce a new version of my component. The vast majority of AMP components have stayed in 0.1, and they've only changed when we've had to introduce changes to the API that would break how the website, how the page behaves. So first, I'm going to look at how components work in general so that we know how to implement it. So by defining a custom element, you get a box. That's basically like a div. This is statically sized with the layout system, and that's available as soon as the page loads. And then your extension executes, and it may modify the DOM inside that box in some way or another. This happens in a specific life cycle. So your extension is always an additional script to the AMP framework, and the lifecycle defines the things that occur from the browser giving you a box before your extension is loaded and ready, and you can actually execute different parts of your code depending on different parts of the interaction. So the life cycle is mostly like this. You have a component that's not built, that is only a box on the page. Your extension code will load, and then the runtime will call your build callback. This is a callback in which you can change the basic structure of the DOM, but you may not load external resources yet. It may be able to be interacted with if you don't have to load external resources, but it doesn't load any external resources yet. After the build callback, it goes to a state of build. And after build, it goes to layout callback. Layout callback is called when the runtime thinks that your component is ready to load external resources. The way it makes this decision is that it waits for the component to be close to the viewport or inside the viewport. So for example, if your component is in the first viewport when the page loads, then your layout callback will be loaded almost immediately as soon as your extension loads. If your component is further down the page, it will maybe take longer for the layout callback to be executed. Then we can fetch an external resources and return a promise to the runtime. After this promise is resolved, the component is now laid out. And after it's laid out, it may be unloaded when the runtime thinks it's no longer necessary to be on the page. On this stage, the component may decide to remove some of its DOM elements to stop extra work from occurring when the user doesn't have to interact with the component. So this may happen when your component is no longer in the viewport and it's way further away from the page again, and it becomes unloaded. And if it's unloaded and has to come back somehow, you may get a layout callback again a number of times so that you can load it and render it again. Of course, depending on what your component does, your logic for layout and on layout will be different. And all stages, or no callbacks for different stages that the runtime may call are optional. So some components may need a build callback. Some components only change the DOM when they can load things. For example, AMP image only creates an image so it knows to wait for layout callback. And some don't need a layout callback because they don't load external resources. All they need is their own code. This is a very basic version of the lifecycle. I skipped some stages. You can see that tiny diagram there that is also available on the based element.js file that describes all the stages. But in general, build callback and layout callback are the most important ones, with some minor optional ones occurring in between. For example, to create a placeholder that is shown before your element is loaded, or to pre-connect to external URLs before the component is ready to layout, to save DNS strips and things like that. But they're all described in base element.js. And there's one thing missing from the extension generator in that we need to register our extension so that it can be built by the runtime. There's this file, bundles.config.js, that has a list of extensions that have to be loaded. In this case, we just register AMP toast with the previous name that we used. We register the version and the latest version. Since we only have 0.1, they're the same. There's an object for options. We are going to write default CSS for this extension. So we tell it that this extension has CSS, that it has to build and that it has to include as part of its script. And we set its type as miscellaneous. There are 3 different types. In most cases, they're miscellaneous unless they're adds. This is an annotation for the builder. This is not an annotation for documentation or how they're categorized on amp.dev. This is just something for how the build step works. So I encourage you to look at the 3 different types for this, but in most cases, it's types.misc. Those types are also described in that same file. Then in our extension code, we're going to look at some basic things. When the generator generates your page, it will create a class that extends from base element. Most AMP components extend from base element. This is the class that gives you the basic tools so that you can respond to the layout callbacks and things like that, and so that the runtime knows how to talk to it. This is a class that is instantiated for every element in the page. So just from extending from base element, you get all these by default. And then we have to register it by calling a specific callbacks in the AMP runtime. These callbacks are there by default, and basically just tell the runtime, hey, when you encounter an element called AMP toast, you have to instantiate my class. So we give it the name, we give it the class, and we also give it a CSS string. The CSS string will be available from build / the name of your extension, and then the version of your extension.css because we told it in bundles.config that it has CSS. So this string is just your minified CSS that is available on amptoast CSS, and then it can be installed when your extension loads. So we can describe JavaScript and CSS that will be loaded asynchronously and will be loaded optionally for each extension. In our build callback, we're actually not creating any DOM because we're using the DOM that is inside the amptoast container. So we just register the action that we want to occur when the user says that your toast should pop. In this case, the base element class provides a register default action method, which will give it a callback to pop, and we'll tell it that it can also be called on pop. So it's a default action because in the AMP action system, you can execute an action on a default action on an element that doesn't require the name of the action or method, and that's what happened by default, but it also will have an alias. So in this case, this means that the extension can be, that the action can be executed when you just reference the toast element or when you reference the toast element .pop. This pop method we will write later. And the pop method, it's just going to show the element because it's hidden by default. So we use the toggle utility that is also provided by the AMP code base. We add an internal class name called pop so that we can trigger a CSS animation. And then when the CSS animation ends, we just remove this class name. And this would be the CSS that we would include in amptoast.css, just default styling so that the element is floating on the page and that it's at a certain position in the bottom left corner, and the keyframe animation that it triggers. So it's just an animation that lasts 2 seconds because it's the entirety of when it pops out and then it pops back in. So from 0% to 10%, it goes from being hidden to being displayed by translating. And then from 90% to 100%, it goes from being visible to hiding in the same direction. This is just specific to what this extension does. It's important to know that since all extensions are loaded asynchronously, the CSS that I create for my extension is not going to be available immediately when the page is displayed because the extension may load afterwards. So we cannot rely on these styles to not shift the layout of the page. In this case, we don't care because the toast element is no display by default. So it's not going to cause any issues in between the page displaying and the extension loading because it's not displayed until the extension loads anyway. And that's basically the implementation for our component. That is everything we need to create this custom functionality, but we also need to add ownership to our extension. So we'll create an owners file on our amptoast directory that has a rule to add you as a maintainer of your code and also an additional working group. In this case, since it's a UI component, I will also add the UI and accessibility working group. This ownership system basically forbids other members of the AMP team to submit code to this directory without being approved by any member in this owners file. Since in this case, since it points to also a working group, it means that any person in that working group can approve changes to that directory. You can look at any owners file in our repo to see how this syntax works and other details about it. But in most cases, you will have to only add yourself in a working group, and your owners file will work this way. After you have your extension ready, you can file a pull request and get approval. You can see which working groups you need to get approval from, depending on which type of extension you're building. This would be the same working groups that were involved in intent to implement and design reviews. And then you can be approved by a specific member. How are you approved by a specific member? The owner's bot. In most cases, if you add an extension, the owner's bot will add a member of the UI and accessibility working group. But in some cases, you may get approval from a member of the analytics or ads working groups. If you're making changes to stories, you need to get approval from a member of the stories working group. And the owner's bot knows which people to assign. After your component, after you go through iterations of reviews and your component gets approved, and the code for your component gets approved, you just have to wait for release after it's merged. We have many details on our release schedule since we have different channels going from beta, experimental, and production. But in general, you can know that production is pushed every Tuesday, and it will take typically 1 to 2 weeks for your change to be live after it goes through beta channels. So this is kind of the time frame that you can expect for it to be approved and live. And that's it. Your component is live and usable by all AMP pages.